Hi, my name is América and I'm going to explain the flowchart. For this project, we chose a really interesting experiment which is called the lost email method. This was inspired by Milgram's lost letter technique, which was a method created in 1977 designed to measure the attitude of different people, but it was using letters. This time, the Milgram's lost letter technique was adapted to the age of the internet, and now instead of using letters, it used email. In this lost email method, there were used two experiments, so we are going to analyze both of them. First, we will start with the observation. In 1934, Richard Lapierre published an article that demonstrated that people who shared intentions of discrimination were unlikely to actually discriminate. This led Milgram to create a method that addresses the possible incongruence between measured attitude and behavior using letters. Now we will see if the internet is a useful tool to recreate this method. The general statement of the problem of both experiments is: could the lost email method be a useful application of the internet to measure attitude? Now, the specific statement of the problem and the hypothesis were different for both experiments. This is because the subjects of study were different too. In the first experiment, the subjects of study were college students. And the specific statement of the problem is: can we measure the attitude of college students using Milgram's lost letter technique via email? And the hypothesis of this first experiment is that the more socially appropriate messages will be more likely to be sent on than those less socially appropriate messages. And it was also hypothesized that the more urgent messages will be more likely to be sent on. For the second experiment, the subject of study was a larger and more diverse population, and they were asked about a controversial president's candidate whose name was Ross Perot. The statement of the problem is: could we measure the attitude towards a controversial president candidate using Milgram's lost letter technique via email? It's important to know that in this experiment, different messages were sent. One message included information about the president candidate, and others didn't contain anything about him. So it was hypothesized that the messages that contained information about Ross Perot would be less likely to be sent on. For the analysis, the variables of urgency, the acceptance towards the college, and the support towards Ross Perot didn't change. However, the messages demonstrated that they were returned usually to the sender instead of the intended recipient, no matter how urgent the message is. And the conclusion was that these two experiments made us realize how changes in the communication media can lead to changes in our communication itself. For example, with email, we received different behaviors than what we would expect from a traditional lost letter study. In this investigation, the research technique that was used was the documentary research. This is because the creators of the experiment were based on an article published by Richard Lapierre, where he said that people who shared intentions of discriminating people were actually unlikely to discriminate. The sources of information that were used were three. One, that is the article published by Richard Lapierre. Two, that are the social and psychological aspects of computer-mediated communication. And three, that is the Journal of Social Behavior and Personality. Now I will talk about the observation cards, which contain important information about the both experiments. Well, I will start with the experiment 1. The description of the situation is that lost email messages were sent to all existing faculty accounts at a small college. And the comments and analysis is that 19% of the sent messages were returned to the sending account. And all those messages that were returned, the students wrote a message of their own. In the second observation card of the experiment 2, the description of the situation is that the lost email method was used to study attitudes towards Ross Perot, an unpopular presidential candidate. And the comments and analysis is that 29% of these messages were returned, from which 52% had a negative attitude and 48% had a neutral attitude. In this case, no messages had a positive attitude towards Ross Perot. Finally, I will talk about the research methods that were used in these experiments. These were two. The first one is the comparative method. This is because in both experiments the variables were changed in order to compare and analyze their results. And the second method is the mixed method. This is because the two experiments cover both behavior and numerical data. And with that, this is the end of the explanation of the flowchart. Thanks for watching.
Hi, my name is Naomi and I'm going to explain the summary of the experiment. This investigation was based on applying the lost letter method of Milgram, but as it says in the title, in the age of the internet, meaning that we're going to change the letter for the more used communication way in that time that was the emails. The original experiment had as its purpose addressing the incongruence between measured attitude and behavior toward different groups, such as the Nazi organization, that was the group that they used in the first experiment, the one that was made with letters. But since the apparition of the email, the main way of mail changed, making the email an easier and more used way to communicate, and with this, changes in the behavior occur, meaning that we could obtain different results in a new investigation based in the past investigation because a variable changed, one that was very important. To obtain results, two experiments were made, where one consisted of sending messages to faculties of a college, and the hypothesis was that more social and positive messages towards the school were more likely to be sent, and also the most urgent ones, obtaining no significant effects because it didn't happen something like incredible because of that variables. Well, the second one consisted in studying attitudes against a controversial candidate to the presidency that in that time was Ross Perot. So the hypothesis was that these messages were more likely to not be sent, although in the result we do not see a significant difference in comparison to the first experiment. It was a difference for like 5% of the people, but it was not a significant difference to say that it was because of the variable or because of the presidents, the candidate presidents. We can observe from the results that the first experiments demonstrate how different the letters and emails are treated, where the second are returned to the sender instead of being direct to the recipient, while the second experiment challenges the original hypothesis, concluding that both of them illustrate how changes in our means of communication lead to changes in norms surrounding communication. Thank you. The keywords are words that are important in the experiment or in an investigation, so are words that are constantly in the text and that we can identify, so it's important to know their meaning. For example, we have the lost letter method, that is the name of the first investigation, the social psychology because it's the social science that is applied in this investigation and the experiments too, behavior because it's part of the hypothesis, the technique because it's an important term to know if you are doing an investigation, and attitude that comes with behavior.
Hi, now we're going to give you a brief introduction. Stanley Milgram was a social psychologist best remembered for his famous experiments, one of them being the lost letter technique to address the incongruence between the measured attitude and behavior since they concern about the difference between what people are willing to say or write on a survey and what they actually do. With the pass of time, the way to communicate changed, and with his human behavior and attitude changed, making necessary to obtain new data to compare, leading to the same experiment, but with different resources and experiments adapted to new times, like in the times we are right now. Now the background is, investigations are so important in order to get to the bottom of things. By proper investigation, one can find the reasons and or causes for incidents that have happened in the past. Sometimes it is very important to know exactly and truthfully what happened in order to reduce the risk of it happening again. Only by proper investigation one can truly know what happened in reality and then learn from that.
Hi, I am Marián, and at this time I'm going to explain the main question and the question of the investigation. First of all, the main question. We decide that it was this question since it goes according to the investigation and the experiment. Could the lost letter method be useful when applying it according to the communication tools of the actual time for the measurement of attitudes? This is the most important question of the research, and from this the secondary questions are developed. Then we have 6 more. Among these are: will the messages that mention an unpopular candidate be less likely to be returned to the sending account? This question is according to the results that were obtained. The second question is: will the urgent messages be more likely to send on? The next one is: what happened in the experiments? We need to take into account that 2 experiments were carried out. Therefore, we will have to compare what happened in each one. How did the investigation happen? Then, how much difference is going to exist between the lost letter experiment and the lost email experiments? We will be able to realize that this answer is obtained as the investigation develops. And the last question is there any electronic or physical evidence to document this occurrence? That's all of the questions. The next point that I'm going to explain is the general objective of the investigation. To analyze the problems and preferences of humanity, consider their opinions in order to carry out various actions that are beneficial. In this case, this experiment shows us a little bit of people's attitude and honesty. Even with this, we can see the values that each one of them has.
The specific objective of the present study was to examine whether the lost email method could be a useful application of the Internet for the measurement of the attitudes that the people have. Justification of the investigation. This investigation is relevant within today's society because it enables us to find a method that spots the potential incongruence between what people are willing to say or write in a survey and what they actually do. Something that psychologists interested in attitude measurement have been concerned about since centuries ago. The result obtained from this would be helpful to understand the mentality and behavior of the modern people.
Now a little more about this experiment. We made an investigation to get previous knowledge about it. The lost letter technique is an experiment developed to measure people's attitude by dropping stamped letters addressed to several public organizations or political institutions. The letters are dropped in public places to see how many people are capable of returning the letters via the email. In this experiment, it is assumed that the people will return the letter relying on their attitude towards the addressed institution. Lynn Milgram studied the use of the lost letter technique. He and his partners dropped stamped letters that were addressed to medical research associates, friends of the Communist Party, friends of the Nazi Party, and a private individual. Moreover, Milgram used this technique to predict the presidential election results of the USA government by dropping some letters in the election wards. Consequently, researchers have found that the lost letter technique will support the study of helping behavior. By changing the features of the letters, researchers can identify the determinants that raise the opportunities that people help to return the lost letters.
Development. The development of the lost email method consists of two experiments. In the first experiment, lost emails referring to different socially controversial themes were sent to accounts of college students. The message including both the sender and addresses email, in which they would receive the responses. These messages were varied in its content, some being positive or negative, and others being more urgent than others. They all were sent out on the same day, and the responses of all message responses were tabulated 12 days after the mailing. And for the second experiment, lost emails regarding a controversial president candidate, Ross Perot, in that time, were sent to 200 accounts of a larger and more diverse population. The two types of message were sent, one being a control message that didn't include information about Perot, and an experimental message that directly supported Perot. In this experiment, the email's address of the recipient was not included in the message, and the responses were tabulated simply on the number of control message versus experimental message returned.
This experiment, as we realized, it was not necessarily the use of materials such as questionnaires, interviews, surveys, or fire cards. Instead of these materials, the Journal of Social Behavior and Personality and the article published by Richard Lapierre were used to build on the investigation.
One of the most important points to explain are the results, since they vary due to the fact that two types were performed and in different contexts. In the first experiment, 90% of the messages received were returned to the sending account, taking into consideration that there were lost email messages sent to account at a small college. And in the second experiment, the lost email method was used to study people's attitude about an unpopular presidential candidate, in which 29% of the messages were returned by the participants, and no responses expressed a positive attitude about Rose Perot, the unpopular presidential candidate.